The sky was the color of pale bone, stretched thin over a land where the wind tasted of dust and distance. Margaret Hale moved through it like a shadow wearing itself thin, her faded calico dress clinging to her legs with each step. In one arm she cradled her infant son, his small face pressed into the curve of her neck. With the other, she steadied her toddler daughter, whose bare feet stumbled in the sand, tiny fingers wrapped tight around the hem of her mother's skirt. Her boots had long since split at the seams, the leather curling back like dry bark. The shawl on her shoulders was stiff with dried milk and sweat, its once bright weave dulled to the color of old ashes. She had been walking for weeks, perhaps months. It was hard to measure time when days bled into each other, and hunger hollowed the mind as much as the body. The town rose slowly from the shimmer of heat ahead, squat buildings lined along a single stretch of road, their boards warped from sun and years. Margaret's eyes found the water pump first, and for a heartbeat, she felt the faintest lift of hope. But as she drew closer, faces turned away. A man at the pump, broad-shouldered in a leather apron, paused in his work just long enough to glance at her, then bent back to his task without a word. The sound of iron on iron clanged from the blacksmith's shop, though no one stepped forward to greet her. The windows of the general store reflected only the sky. She passed a woman in a faded blue bonnet who muttered something low, her eyes skimming over the children before she moved briskly away. The words, "Indian country," floated back on the wind, but Margaret did not turn. She knew too well how quickly strangers became accusers when desperation entered the room. Her legs carried her past the last of the buildings to where a small, sagging-lined shack leaned into the earth at the town's edge. The door hung open, its latch long gone, and inside she found four walls, a rusted stove, and a table with one leg propped on a stone. It would keep the wind off the children for now. She set her son on the table to adjust her shawl, then lowered him to the floor beside his sister, who curled against him like a small animal seeking warmth. Far above the town, on a ridge where the stone caught the last of the afternoon light, a man watched. Taza, Apache hunter, son of a land that had been shrinking beneath his feet since the day he was born, stood still beside his pony. He had been tracking mule deer when the movement below caught his eye, not the usual stirrings of townsfolk, but the slow, stubborn figure of a woman burdened by two children. He watched the angle of her shoulders, the deliberate pace of her steps, the way she carried the weight of those little bodies as though she had carried them across more than just miles. He did not move to approach. The desert taught a man patience, and he knew that sometimes the first kindness was in letting another soul decide if they wanted to be seen. The wind shifted, carrying up the distant creak of the shack's door as she disappeared inside. For a long moment, he kept his gaze fixed on that doorway, reading something in the silence that followed. Below, Margaret knelt by the stove, running her hand along its rusted surface. Her fingers came away orange with iron. The air inside smelled faintly of old wood and dust, and through the cracks in the boards, she could see the pale sky thinning toward evening. She pulled the children close, her body making a small shelter of itself, and listened to the emptiness settle around them like a second skin. It was the kind of stillness she knew well, the kind that could mean safety or danger, depending on who broke it first. Out here, survival might depend on a neighbor's mercy. But as she closed her eyes against the dry ache in them, she understood something colder. Sometimes, there were no neighbors willing to see you at all. By morning, the shack smelled of dust and stale wood, the kind of air that seemed to have been sealed in for years. The roof let down a slow sift of powder whenever the wind shook the boards, and the stove in the corner wore its rust like scabs that would never heal. Margaret moved quietly, so as not to wake the baby sleeping in the crook of her arm, while her daughter sat on the floor stacking smooth stones she had found outside. She poured water from the bucket she'd carried up from the pump. A gray film floated on its surface, and when she tipped it into a dented tin pot, grit rasped against the bottom. Still, she set it on the stove's top, coaxing a small flame from a stub of wood and the last of her matches. She needed it warm to soften the bread heel in her bundle, a single piece hard enough to knock against the pot. Her mind wandered as she worked, but not to peace. Memories came in shards, unbidden and sharp. Her husband's voice calling to the herd at dawn, the weight of a new ring on her finger when she was barely past girlhood, the smell of dust rising with the cattle. Then the day the riders came, shouting, firing, scattering the herd, one bullet finding him before she could even scream his name. After that, the dry-eyed faces of his kin, offering her no place at their table, no place anywhere. A woman who can't stand on her own feet isn't worth feeding, his brother had told her, as though she hadn't been standing all along. The road since had been nothing but horizon and hunger, each step taking her farther from the life she'd thought was hers. On the ridge beyond the shack, Taza moved silently between the rocks, his horse trailing without a sound. He had kept his distance yesterday, but now he came closer, close enough to see the roof's tilt, the woman's small frame moving inside. Her shawl was patched in uneven squares, her hair pinned in a knot that seemed ready to come undone. He knew the shape of loss in another's movements. His own wife had been taken by fever one spring, her breath growing lighter until it was gone entirely. The child she carried into the world lived only one summer, a small boy with dark eyes who now lay beneath the cottonwood at the edge of the river. His people had scattered since then, some driven deep into the hills, others taken by the army or lured into towns that promised nothing but suspicion. He watched her lift the pot from the stove and break the bread into it, shaking her head as the crumbs disappeared in the cloudy water. Her children's faces turned to her in unspoken trust, and something inside him tightened. This was not pity, it was recognition. She, too, lived in a place that did not want her. As evening fell, the air thinned with cold. Margaret wrapped both children in her shawl and sat against the wall, the dull kitchen knife in her lap. The shadows outside grew long, their edges stretching across the room like reaching fingers. Then came the sound, low, yipping cries from the dark. Coyotes, too close. Their calls circled the shack, the scrape of paws in the dirt audible between the gusts of wind. Margaret tightened her grip on the knife, her pulse hammering in her ears. Beyond the small window, movement caught her eye, not the quick dart of an animal, but the slow, deliberate shape of a man. She froze, the knife poised. In the dim light, she saw him raise his arm and swing it downward. A stone clattered, followed by a sharp, commanding shout in a tongue she didn't understand. The cries of the coyotes broke, scattered, and faded into the distance. She remained still long after the last sound had gone. The figure outside lingered a moment longer, just beyond the line of the lamplight, then turned and disappeared into the dark. Margaret exhaled, only then realizing how tightly she had been holding her breath. She didn't know if she should be afraid of the man or grateful to him. All she knew was that in the space of a single night, the desert no longer felt entirely empty. Someone out there had seen her, and, for reasons she could not name, had decided she was worth protecting. The afternoon sky dimmed in a way that made Margaret glance up from the bucket she'd been scrubbing. Out beyond the mesquite, the horizon had turned the color of copper, a rolling wall of grit rising higher with each heartbeat. The wind came first as a hiss, then as a low roar, bending the scrub and sending fine dust through the cracks in the shack before she could reach the door. She pulled the children close, wrapping them in her shawl, then dragged the only blanket she owned toward the frame to seal the gap. The fabric puffed and snapped under the pressure of the wind, grit working through its weave to sting her hands. The air thickened until it tasted like clay between her teeth. Outside, something banged against the wall, and the door rattled in its frame like a tooth ready to fall. The baby began to cry, coughing between wails. Margaret pressed him against her shoulder, her own breathing shallow as she braced one foot against the door. A sharp gust drove a spray of dust through the roof, stinging her eyes. For a moment, she feared the whole place would lift away and scatter into the desert like the dead grass around it. Then the door swung open, pushed from the outside, and a figure stepped in without knocking. He filled the space with the scent of leather and wind, his face lined deeply by years in the sun. His hair, bound in a single braid down his back, was streaked with gray that caught the dim light. He didn't speak. Taza moved with the economy of a man who knew what needed doing. In 2 strides he was at the wall, pressing his shoulder into the boards to steady them while he wedged a loose plank back into place. From a bundle on his back, he pulled a folded hide and spread it across the gaps in the roof, weighting the edges with stones from the hearth. Margaret didn't move, unsure whether to help or stay out of his way. The toddler whimpered, hands over her ears, until Taza turned and knelt beside her. Without looking at Margaret, he lifted the child into his arms, settling her against his chest. The storm's howl seemed to dim around them, and within minutes, the girl's eyes had closed. Margaret found herself watching the way his hand rested lightly against the child's back, not patting or rocking, just steady, as if lending her some of his own stillness. The wind battered the shack for what felt like hours, the walls groaning under its weight. Margaret crouched by the stove, keeping the baby wrapped tight, every muscle taut. But each time she looked toward the door, Taza was there, shoulder to the frame, braids shifting slightly in the gusts, eyes fixed on the boards as though daring them to give way. When at last the sound began to fade, the air inside thick with dust and the taste of earth, Taza lowered the toddler gently onto the bedroll. He stepped past Margaret to the table and set down a small leather pouch. She could see the outlines of what it held, strips of dried meat, a folded twist of cornmeal, and something hard and dark that she guessed was flint. Before she could form a word, thanks, or even a question, he had turned toward the door. The light outside had shifted to the muted gold that comes after a storm, and his silhouette was briefly framed there, tall and solid against the horizon. Then he was gone, as if the wind had carried him off just as it had arrived. Margaret stood for a long time in the quiet, her ears still ringing. The baby stirred, and she shifted him to her other arm. Her eyes went to the pouch on the table. It was more than she had in the whole shack, yet it was the silence he'd left behind that seemed to fill her most. The desert was still wide and empty, the town still cold. But now, somewhere in that vastness, she knew there was someone who had stepped inside her world not to claim it, but to steady it when it began to fall apart. The trouble began with a voice behind her at the pump. Margaret had been filling her bucket, her hands stiff from the cold, when a ranch hand in a sweat-stained hat stepped close enough for her to smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "You'd best tell your Indian friend to quit hanging around," he said, his tone more warning than advice. "Folks are starting to wonder if he's scouting for raiders, or maybe just scouting you." She didn't answer, but the words followed her back to the shack like burrs caught in her skirt. By the end of the week, she felt the shift in town. The storekeeper's wife, who had once looked the other way when Margaret's coins came up short, now counted each penny aloud and added a few extra cents to the cost of flour. At the feed store, a man leaned on the counter and asked, loud enough for others to hear, if she planned on marrying her protector. The children were too young to understand the weight behind those words, but they noticed the way she gripped their hands tighter in town. She told herself it would pass, that gossip was just another kind of weather, noisy but short-lived. But some days she feared it could harden into something sharper. It was near sunset when she saw him again. The light caught on his braid as he stepped into the clearing, a small rabbit hanging from one hand, the other filled with sprigs of desert herbs bound with a strip of leather. He ducked under the doorway, his shoulders brushing the frame. For a moment, neither spoke. His eyes, dark and steady, moved over her face as though reading a page he already knew by heart. He must have seen the shadow of worry there, because he set the food down and spoke, his English halting but certain. "People talk because they are empty inside," he said. "Empty people make noise." Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She had meant to tell him, meant to ask him to stay away until the talk in town died down, but the words tangled and frayed. He stood waiting, the quiet between them deeper than the one outside. "I will not come," he said, "if you do not wish it." The room seemed smaller for the way his voice filled it, low, even, without plea or threat. She looked toward the children, who had been playing with a tin cup on the floor. When they saw him, they dropped it and ran to him without a flicker of hesitation, the girl wrapping herself around his leg, the boy lifting his arms in the simple, certain request to be held. Margaret felt something shift in her then, though she could not name it. It was a pull between two hungers, the need to shield her children from harm, and the quiet safety she felt when this man was near. The air inside the shack carried both tensions, the one that warned her to keep her distance and the one that drew her closer. He crouched to let the children climb into his lap, the herbs still in his hand releasing a faint, clean scent. She busied herself at the stove, pretending to work while her ears caught the sound of her daughter's small voice telling him about the stones she'd collected by the creek. He listened without interrupting, his head bent slightly toward her as if no other sound in the world mattered. When he rose to leave, he left the rabbit skinned and the herbs tied in a neat bundle on the table. His eyes met hers just long enough to press the choice into her, whether to let him keep coming or to close the door against him. She watched him walk back into the dusk, his figure thinning into the same horizon that had brought him to her. The door shut with a soft thud, but the air inside still held the warmth of his presence, like coals banked low in the hearth, waiting for a hand to stir them into flame. Winter came earlier than she had expected. One morning, the mesquite outside wore a thin lace of frost, and when Margaret exhaled, her breath drifted in the cold air of the shack as clearly as if she'd stepped outside. The baby's cough had worsened in the night, a dry, racking sound that seemed to shake through his small frame. She wrapped him in the thickest cloth she had, but it did little against the chill. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the smell of snow from the higher ground. She was banking the stove with the last of the dry kindling when a knock came, not loud, just enough to be heard over the creak of the boards. Taza stepped in without waiting for her to answer, his arms burdened with an armful of wood, the bark dusting the floor as he set it down. His coat was worn, with a tear at the side that had been mended more than once with sinew, the stitches uneven but strong. He glanced at the baby, then at her, and without a word began stacking the logs neatly by the stove before feeding the first into the firebox. The room began to warm slowly, the orange glow licking at the walls, the shadows pulling back just enough to soften the hard edges of the place. He stayed, tending the fire, his presence unhurried. When the baby coughed again, he moved closer, resting a broad hand gently on the child's back as though lending him some of his own steadiness. They talked more than they ever had before, the hours stretched by the cold outside. He told her of a river he had fished as a boy, the water clear enough to see the stones on the bottom. He spoke of its sound at night, the way it whispered to the trees. She told him of her mother's weaving, the smell of wool drying by the hearth, the way her hands had known the shuttle without needing to watch. They spoke, too, of what it was to lose a home, not just the walls and roof, but the certainty that it was yours to return to. In his voice, she heard the same hollow her own heart had carried for so long. The firelight painted the room in gold and shadow, the cracks in the walls softened, the rust on the stove forgotten. It felt, for the first time since she had stepped into it, less like a place to endure and more like a place to keep. The children, lulled by the warmth, fell asleep against the pile of blankets in the corner. Margaret sat opposite him, the flames between them casting light over his face, the fine lines carved by wind and years. When he shifted to add another log, his coat fell open slightly, and she saw the scar, an uneven slash that ran across his ribs, pale against the bronze of his skin. It looked old, but not forgotten. She found herself watching the way his hands lingered above the fire, not too close, as if the heat were an old acquaintance he respected but did not quite trust. In the stillness, the crackle of the fire seemed to say more than either of them dared. When his hand finally reached across the small space between them, it did not grasp or pull, it rested lightly on hers, warm and sure. It was not the touch of a man seeking to claim, but of one acknowledging what was already there, quiet and unspoken. She did not pull away. The trouble came without warning, as trouble often does. Margaret had gone into town for flour and lamp oil, the children trailing close behind her. The air smelled of spilled whiskey, and the sound of boots dragging in the dirt made her glance over her shoulder. 3 ranch hands stood by the corner of the general store, their faces ruddy from drink, their eyes sharp with something meaner than curiosity. One stepped forward, his hat pushed low, his words slurred but heavy. "Heard you've taken up with an Indian," he said, loud enough for everyone within earshot to turn. "You think that makes you better than the rest of us? Or just too good for your own kind?" She kept her head down, tightening her grip on her daughter's hand, but they moved to block her path. Another reached out and caught her arm, his fingers biting through the thin fabric of her sleeve. The children pressed in against her legs, their breaths quick. Before she could speak, a shadow moved from the mouth of the alley. Taza stepped into the light, his rifle in one hand, held low but steady. His eyes did not flicker, his voice cut through the dust and noise like a blade. "Let her go." The man holding her hesitated just long enough for Taza to take a single step closer. The barrel of the rifle lifted, deliberate and certain, and the air seemed to tighten between them. No one laughed now. The ranch hand's grip loosened, and he stepped back, muttering something under his breath. The others followed, retreating with curses that were already smaller than the sound of their boots on the street. Taza's gaze swept the street once, then dropped to her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't need to. The answer was already written in the way her shoulders lowered, the way her breath steadied with him there. She knew then what she had to do. The shack at the edge of town had been a shelter, but it was no home. Not anymore. She knelt to gather the children, her voice low and certain as she told them to hold on tight. Taza's spare horse stood tied at the hitching post, its dark coat gleaming in the late light. She mounted with his help, settling the baby against her chest and her daughter in front of her. They rode out past the last fence line, where the land opened into a sweep of pale gold, the air carrying the scent of wet earth from rains that had passed unseen. The mesquite gave way to low grass, green in the hollows, the kind of green that promised a softer season ahead. The children grew quiet, the rhythm of the horse's gait rocking them toward sleep. Margaret kept her eyes on the horizon, its wide curve unbroken. She had no promise of what lay ahead, only the knowledge that it would be far from the eyes that had measured her worth in whispers and suspicion. Taza rode beside her, not close enough to press, but near enough that the sound of his horse's hooves matched hers. She felt the weight of his presence without needing to look. It was not the weight of a man who meant to claim her, nor of one seeking to bind her to him. It was the kind of weight that steadied rather than held down, like a hand resting on the edge of a table you leaned against. When the sun dipped low, painting the clouds in copper and rose, the children slept against her, their small breaths warmed through her shawl. She let her gaze follow the fading light, the sweep of land that belonged to no one and to everyone. She understood then that dignity was not a thing to be handed down or taken away, it was something a person reclaimed, step by step, mile by mile. She did not know where the trail would lead, but for the first time in years, she did not fear it.